Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is a video I've been meaning to do for a while actually, but I recently got involved in a discussion in the comments on one of my videos about a similar topic because somebody made a reference to a particular political candidate that he apparently thought that Tolkien would endorse if he had been a modern American, and I kind of got into that discussion with him. I won't go into the details, but it got me the urge to kind of finally do this video. And it's really interesting because Tolkien didn't write a whole lot in his published letters that you can directly say, well, that's his politics. He did definitely say a few things that give us some ideas, but there's also a lot in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that give us a pretty good idea of what his politics might have been as well. So I'm going to start with what he said explicitly in places like his letters, and then I'm going to talk about how that might have been further explained by things that we can see in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and see where that leads us in terms of figuring out what were Tolkien's political views. Of course, major caveat here, because I'm mostly working by inference, I'm obviously not going to be saying that this is definitely what his politics were, and there's not really enough out there to be certain of all his political views, but some of them I think we can kind of nail down. So, of course, one of the most famous things that Tolkien said related to politics in his letters was one that he wrote to Christopher Tolkien, where he basically said, "My own political feelings lean more and more toward anarchy," meaning philosophically a lack of control, not whiskered men with bombs, or to unconstitutional monarchy. Now, this is one of those where, a lot of libertarians will like to say Tolkien was an anarchist, which is kind of fair and kind of not. And this is the interesting thing about Tolkien and his politics, I think. What we'll see throughout this is that a lot of different groups would like to claim Tolkien because of one little thing he said here or there. This is where the libertarians kind of like to grab on and say Tolkien was an anarchist. But his immediate follow-up to that is unconstitutional monarchy. So I don't think he's thinking of this in the same way that necessarily the libertarian who favors anarchy is thinking about this. Another similar one would be, for example, environmentalists in the Green Party might think that they can claim Tolkien because Tolkien was kind of anti-industrialization, very pro-tree, that sort of thing. But here again, I don't think that you can put Tolkien in that camp just because of that one particular viewpoint. So, there's definitely things about Tolkien that match that, but Tolkien's view of politics and economics are a lot more nuanced than any given party or ideology will fit. I think he's a little more complicated than, us versus them politics. His politics are much more nuanced. And you can see that in this first quote about, I lean toward anarchy or unconstitutional monarchy. At first glance, those two things seem like they would be completely opposed to each other. And so, how do you even reconcile them? Well, you have to definitely get a little more complicated to do that. And one of the other things that he says in his letters, which kind of helps us in this regard, and I don't remember if it was in the same letter or a different one, but he basically said something along the lines of, anybody who uses the word state or government, I forget which one it was, like with a capital letter in the sense of an entity that exists as opposed to, I'm pretty sure it was government, because what he follows up with is basically, if you mean it something other than the process of governing, i.e., you mean this particular body of people who is in the government as opposed to just the process of governing a nation, I would basically take them out and shoot them. They should be shot. Uh, so you're kind of getting here again in opposition to something like state worship, or being too heavily focused on the state being something that's really critical or important in a person's life. He thinks government is necessary, perhaps, because he does think that there is a process of governing that needs to happen, but he's not for treating the government as like this thing that we have to look up to. So if we take these two things together, we can start to get some idea that Tolkien is not very pro-government. That doesn't make him libertarian. And we can kind of see some more of his views by starting to look at The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So let's take a look at what we can see in The Hobbit. So The Hobbit doesn't really get a lot into anything political much, because most of it is just the Hobbit and the dwarves journeying from Hobbiton to the Lonely Mountain. The only political system we ever get a glimpse of, really, is Lake Town. And we know very little about Lake Town, except that the master of Lake Town is very interested with money, and he's an elected official. And we know that he's an elected official because Bard, after the dragon has been killed, and the people are saying, we want Bard to be our king, and he happens to be descended from the old line of kings from Dale, so kind of makes sense. And also he just killed the dragon, so, you know, very fairy tale like. Bard says, basically, I'm not going to be king. We still have an elected, you know, master, and we'll continue to do that as we always have done. And so you definitely get that idea of the Lake Town politic is, at least in some sense, democratic, in that the master of Lake Town is elected. And we do get references to the master being, you know, mostly interested in trade policy and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing that we see about that is Bard ends up becoming actually King of Dale, and we'll find out a little bit more about him in the Lord of the Rings appendices and whatnot. He turns out to be quite a good king. We don't really hear a whole lot about him politically, but he ends up being a good king, whereas the Master of Lake Town ends up being kind of a politician. And you can see this as the hobbits, the dwarves and Bilbo arrive. You get some insight into his thinking process, because you can see that he's kind of trying to navigate, I don't want all these dwarves here, but all these people are like really happy about him being here because they think they're gonna fulfill prophecies about, you know, the river running with gold and all this other stuff. And so he's kind of politically trying to navigate, how do I get these people out of town so that we don't have to take care of them because they have no food and they have no, it's like he's trying to figure out a way to not have to, expend money out of the public fisc, so to speak. So he's doing all these things, and you can see the mental machinations in some of the passages. But also, interestingly enough, at the end of the book, we find out that after some of the treasure from Smaug's hoard was given to the people of Lake Town in order to rebuild, he ends up making off with a large chunk of it and running off into the wilderness with some other less than savory characters, and comes to a bad end. And so you can kind of get the idea here that Tolkien was not necessarily in favor of an elected government, because you get the idea that the Master of Lake Town is kind of representative of this idea, which a lot of, left-leaning people like in the Democratic Party or even socialists would say is, you've got rich people running the government, and therefore we should, totally change the system and get rid of all that, because rich people just end up taking over the government and running it for their own purposes. So again, you see where some other political groups might want to claim Tolkien here, but again, you can't really put Tolkien in a socialist, you can't put the Tolkien peg in a socialist hole, because Tolkien is definitely not saying anything like socialism. He's merely criticizing the fact that in a democracy where you have elected officials, those elected officials can become corrupt. And even though you do see a lot of examples, and here we move kind of into the Lord of the Rings, you do see a lot of examples of unconstitutional monarchy. For example, you see Theoden and Rohan, you see obviously Aragorn once he takes over the kingship of Gondor, and you also see Bard as King of Dale and you get the idea that all of these turn out well. In fact, there doesn't seem to be really any example of an unconstitutional monarchy in Tolkien that's a bad system. You do see leaders in those systems that end up being bad. So, for instance, Denethor, he's not technically the monarch, but effectively he is the monarch of Gondor until he dies. Denethor himself becomes corrupt because of his own personal issues with, him wanting to maintain his own power, and the way he interacts with his sons, and the fact that Boromir and Faramir both die, and then he kind of collapses mentally and emotionally. But the system itself is never really a part of that. He kind of messes up the running of the system because Denethor himself is a bad guy, but we see counterexamples, like I said, in Aragorn and Theoden and King Bard of Dale. We get all these other unconstitutional monarchies, and of course, all the Elven kingdoms are unconstitutional monarchies, which we don't really have any Elven kingdoms much by the Third Age, other than Thranduil and Mirkwood. That's really the only one left. And Celeborn and Galadriel are kind of in a monarchy, but you don't really get the sense that there's any politics there at all. They're kind of considered the leaders, but it's not like they're making decrees. They're just kind of the unspoken leaders because they're the greatest of the elves in the area. They're never referred to as king or queen. So you definitely have all these examples of monarchies or something like monarchies that turn out well, which is really interesting. But how do we actually kind of put all that together? Well, there's a few other things we can look at, and here we go back to the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, where he kind of described the Shire government. The Shire government is basically non-existent. It is the example of anarchy in Tolkien's world. It's the only one we have, except maybe Bree, although it's not really clear if Bree has anything like a government structure. We don't get that much detail about it. But certainly the Shire is. The only things that look even remotely like a government in the Shire are you have a mayor whose apparently only function is to preside at holiday feasts and get really fat. And you have sheriffs whose really only function is to, well, sheriffs and bounders. Sheriffs kind of basically keep track of stray animals for the most part, as far as what we can gather from the prologue, although later on we will see them being repurposed to do nastier things in the Scouring of the Shire chapter. And then the bounders basically just keep an eye on the borders to make sure nothing comes in that's unwanted or unsavory. So, they don't want anything dangerous coming into the Shire and whatnot. It's not like they're being xenophobic and keeping everything out of the Shire, because we know dwarves travel through carrying news and, doing their trade probably. We get examples of that early on, but they're definitely keeping something out. So, I mean, the Shire has borders, but there's no government, really. I mean, there's no body or person that makes the rules. The only sense we have of a set of laws in the Shire is the laws that were ancestrally handed down from when there was still a king in Arnor, which, the king in Arnor is who gave the hobbits permission to settle in the Shire in the first place. And those laws have just been handed down through the generations as being both ancient and just, and therefore you just follow the rules. And the interesting thing about this is the Shire works remarkably well as an anarchy. We get no sense that anybody is terribly unhappy. We do get the idea that some of the hobbits are maybe too greedy for their own good, and that comes a little later. But Frodo will end up saying no hobbit has ever killed another hobbit on purpose in the Shire. And considering the Shire has been there for 1,400 years by the time of The Lord of the Rings, that's a pretty significant statement. Crime is basically non-existent in the Shire, despite there being no government. And so Tolkien here is giving us this image of what a society might look like in the absence of an official government. Now, I don't want to suggest that Tolkien necessarily thinks that any system set up in the way that Gondor is set up, or Rohan is set up, or the Shire is set up is necessarily going to be an idyllic society. I don't think he was that naive. But certainly you can see in these elements ways in which Tolkien is pointing us to the idea that he thinks these are better systems. Now, where you can kind of get a melding of the idea of anarchy and unconstitutional monarchy is things that we see happening in Rohan and Gondor. So both of these are effectively monarchies. Like I said, Denethor's not the king, but he's ruling like a king. I mean, he's got really no check on his power any more than a king would. What we can see kind of from the stuff about the Shire in the prologue is there are laws which are handed down which are both ancient and just. So, I mean, we have a system of laws that basically seems to be in place from who knows how long ago. And beyond that, the rules that get promulgated in Gondor are mainly of the order of military or in the moment types of stuff. So Denethor, in preparation for the attack by Mordor, is he clears the city out of basically all the civilians, brings in as much food as he can, that sort of thing. And you can kind of see this in Rohan as well. Theoden is mostly a military leader and a rewarder of good deeds type thing. So you see him, he has the power to put people in jail, which he does with Éomer, and he has the power to reward people for doing good, which he also does because he lets Éomer out and makes him like his top guy and whatever after he is cured by Gandalf. Denethor, we never really see Denethor doing much of that, but we definitely see that he has the power to do that because of Pippin's oath. Denethor makes him swear fealty, and he says that fealty will be rewarded with love, but oath breaking with vengeance. So he definitely has power over the people who have sworn their service to him, but you don't get the idea that Denethor has like a ton of control over how people run their lives day to day. They just kind of do that on their own, and he's basically out there making, to the extent that we see any decision making on his part at all, mostly military decisions. And that's kind of true of Theoden as well. And the other thing that you do kind of see in both Theoden and Aragorn, and to a lesser extent Denethor, is the idea of the king as being kind of like the final judge, the court of highest resort. So at the end of the story, we see Aragorn making some decisions regarding people who had gotten into legally questionable issues. Baragond, of course, ends up having to, it's questionable whether he had to or not, but he kills somebody while trying to protect Faramir from being burned alive by Denethor. And he kills him in the Houses of the Dead, or the area where the Houses of the Dead are. And this is a completely forbidden thing in the laws of Gondor. And so Aragorn is basically hearing his case, and he eventually kind of gets the really nice Solomon-like thing of, well, you have to leave the guard because what you did was wrong, but you're not going to die because you were doing it to save Faramir. In fact, you're going to become the captain of Faramir's guard in Ithilien. So he finds a way to both follow the law, whatever that law is, because, like I said, some of these are just apparently ancient laws, but he's judging it from a human perspective. He's not doing it in a purely legalistic mode. He's not just saying, well, you broke the law, you got to die. He's saying, you broke the law, and so we have to do something about that. But because of the circumstances, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show mercy, and not only mercy, I'm going to give you a reward because of the good thing that you were trying to do, and in fact succeeded in doing. If it hadn't been for Baragond, Faramir would have been burned alive. So you could see kings acting as judges, kings acting as military leaders, and acting as basically the rewarders of people who do their own thing, but you don't see them promulgating new rules or laws, and you don't see them exerting that much control over the daily lives. And one way that we can see this, Faramir and Éomer both end up kind of breaking the rules a little bit to let Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, in Éomer's case, and Frodo and Sam in Faramir's case, go free without basically capturing them and bringing them into, their respective superiors for judgment of their case. They kind of judge the case on their own. And I've done a video on law breaking in the Lord of the Rings where you can kind of get a deeper sense of that, I'll link to that in the description below. Seems kind of relevant since we're talking about government. Might as well look at laws too. And you could see this idea that there's rules, but they can be kind of bent in certain circumstances because of the situation. And so there's rules, but there's no control. And this is where I come back to what Tolkien said in his letter. Anarchy understood as a lack of control. Yes, there are laws, but we all know that there's gray areas and there are circumstances that are so hyper-specific that the law couldn't have been meant for that. And Aragorn even raises this point with Éomer. He says, I do not think your law was made for such a case. So you get this idea that while there are laws and while there are potential consequences for breaking them, the kings aren't there to basically just make sure everybody follows the law to the T all the time. And in fact, interestingly enough, if you think about it, an unconstitutional monarchy where there's really no bureaucracy kind of is conducive to that, because a king can only do so much. I mean, it's to the extent that the king has any power at all, it's to the extent that the people let him have power. The military has to kind of be on his side, and whoever is, serving him in the moment, if they're not, the king can't accomplish much on his own. And so a lot of the king's power depends upon his own personal cachet with his people. And we can see that to a large extent. Denethor, for all his faults, has a lot of cachet with his people because they do look up to him and they do want to obey him. Baragon is very reluctant to try to break the rules, and there are others of his servants who are perfectly willing to just go along with murdering Faramir and, him committing suicide. But beyond that, they have very little direct power over anybody else's lives, and we can kind of see that. One more thing that I want to bring up here is kind of the economic angle. In the Scouring of the Shire, we can definitely see a lot of things going on. We see a few different comments by people. For example, it's either the Gaffer or Farmer Cotton, I can't remember which now, but makes the point that the mill, which the Sandyman family has been running for who knows how long, that one was broken down and they built a bigger and newer one for Ted Sandyman, who is kind of a rotten character. And he makes a comment about how, he could have just been his own master like his father was, but he, basically turned into an employee. So you get the idea here that Tolkien kind of favors what I think probably is more of a distributist economic system. Distributism has long been considered like a third way that is neither capitalist nor socialist. And you can kind of get a hint of that here, but it's not 100% clear. And so this one I'm not 100% sure on, but it seems like Tolkien is edging in that direction. And certainly that is a very Catholic view to take. A lot of very prominent Catholics in Tolkien's era were talking about this particular view. And that kind of makes sense given his idea of a very decentralized type of political system. So the more people are kind of their own masters, farmers, tradesmen, something like that, and they're not really just cogs in a corporate machine, so to speak, it kind of makes sense that that would go along with a decentralized political structure, because everybody is taking a lot of responsibility for their own livelihoods and all this sort of thing. And you can even kind of see in the course of history in both Britain and the United States, for instance, the more you have a lot of big companies that employ lots and lots of people, the more you get big bureaucracies in the government that run things and describe how those businesses can operate and that sort of thing. I'm not saying there's a causal link there, but it is an interesting historical correlation, and one wonders if Tolkien had this in mind. So this economic angle, we can kind of see he's thinking about the same idea on a different scale. You got the political scale and the economic scale. Another thing in the Scouring of the Shire, and here's where a lot of conservatives will try to claim Tolkien, you have a lot of stuff about how after Saruman has taken over via Lotho Sackville Baggins, this idea that people are going around gathering and sharing. So the men that have been brought in, who are basically all just ruffians, are basically gathering up resources from the hobbits, which was not necessary because nobody was in want in the first place, but they gather it up and then they allegedly share it. But as one of the characters points out, who they're sharing it with, we don't know because we never get any of it back. And so the hobbits are getting poorer and they have less to eat and whatnot. And you get the others who are presumably the men basically just taking, the produce off the hands of the hobbits for their own benefit and not really sharing it at all. And a lot of conservatives would look at this and say, he's clearly criticizing socialism here. And there does seem to be a hint of that because it's done in the name of, doing things for the common good. And yet it looks a lot like what you might see in Soviet Russia or something like that, where you do end up with an enforcement group who basically confiscates things from, the masses, and then the only people who really end up with many resources are the party members. And so it definitely does bear resemblances to that. But there's a reference, and I cannot remember, I think it's in another of Tolkien's letters, but I haven't been able to search and really find it, where he describes this Scouring of the Shire chapter as being in large part based on his own experience with post-war England and the rationing that went on and all that sort of thing. It's not clear to me, therefore, that he is directly poking at socialism, and certainly because of his own expressed desire to not engage in allegory, I don't think we should see it that way. Now, I do think Tolkien would be against socialism. He was a devout Catholic, and of course, Catholic teaching for probably over 100 years now, if my memory serves, has been very anti-socialist because they see socialism as being fundamentally against certain aspects of their own view of what God wants. And so I don't think Tolkien would have been a socialist, but I'm not sure we can necessarily read this particular chapter as being about socialism per se. It could just as easily be about any government system of redistribution, where the redistribution in the end is practically just a means for certain people to obtain gain at the expense of the common man. So there's a lot of that going on. Those are the kind of the economic angles you can see going at play. So how do we synthesize all this? So, like I said, you've got aspects of anarchy even in Tolkien's, unconstitutional monarchies, as he would say. He doesn't like the state or the government as a thing, and he doesn't seem to much like the government taking from people to give to other people, especially if the other people are just the government's own agents. You don't get the impression that he particularly likes a democratic system, or at least he's willing to criticize a democratic system because he can see the flaws. And again, I don't think he's saying that an unconstitutional monarchy would be perfect. You got Denethor. Denethor is definitely a counterexample to the good monarch. So if we're trying to make an overall statement about all of this, you have to take Tolkien in a very nuanced way and see that he is not a naive idealist in terms of any of this. He is perfectly willing to criticize any of the systems that you can see, but he's also pointing towards the idea that he thinks that certain systems are definitely better than others. And I think to the extent that you can draw a single message out of all of this, it's that individual responsibility and decentralized power structures are the way to go. Whether that means a purely anarchic system like the Shire or a sort of a monarchy like Gondor or Rohan, but with a king who has relatively little real power in terms of their ability to rule your lives. That seems to be the general direction he's going. The specifics, not so easy to figure out, except to the extent that we can say that he said in his letter he favors anarchy or unconstitutional monarchy. But beyond that, detail-wise, it's a little bit harder to figure out what exactly he had in mind, and it's not 100% clear what economically he thought was the best way to go. He definitely didn't like industrialization, so probably not the greatest friend of capitalism. Frankly, if I had to guess, I would say he probably would have favored a mostly agrarian society, kind of like what the United States was in the first 50 so years of its existence as a free nation. And, you know, I mean, you basically had a country full of farmers, very little manufacturing, very little industrialization, and a very decentralized power structure. And so I think that's the most specific thing we can get out of Tolkien, but there's definitely a lot here where you have to pull in different elements and see he's not just thinking about this in terms of politically, I'm with this group. That's not the way Tolkien thinks. I think there may be a letter somewhere where he expressed his opinions about a political party in Britain at one point, but I don't remember the details of that, and I don't think it's terribly pertinent because, like I said, I don't think his politics are quite that simple to explain. I don't think he's just siding with a political party and that's kind of it. So I think that more or less is where his politics are going, is just the idea of as little power in the hands of the government as possible and as much individual responsibility in the hands of the individual people as possible. And I think beyond that, he probably wouldn't care hugely how the system was set up beyond that. So that's pretty much what I think we can get out of Tolkien's politics. If you can think of any references to things that might further elucidate his thoughts, or if you can think of different arguments that might lead in a different direction, please do share them in the comments, because I think this is a really interesting conversation to have, because Tolkien is definitely not just some guy with a political view. It seems like he really thought this out, and I think exploring that is really interesting, especially because of that weird juxtaposition of anarchy versus unconstitutional monarchy. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope it gave you some food for thought. Maybe even gave you a reason to rethink your own political views in the broader sense of the term. And if you did like it, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien related trivia. You can of course subscribe to the channel here, and you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.